Hello, my name is Laura Ray and today I'm going to talk about error analysis. My presentation is composed by three parts. Firstly, the introduction where I'm going to explain what error analysis is. Secondly, an analysis of a learner's errors. And finally, my conclusions according to the analysis. So, what is error analysis? It is a study that tries to find out the errors or mistakes that the learners of a second language have. So the error analysis can show at what level of the language the student is. Therefore, what is error and mistake? Errors are the lack of the knowledge of the language, where the learner doesn't know, and that is why he or she makes an error. On the contrary, mistake is when he or she has the knowledge, but he or she makes a mistake because of the lack of attention or interruption in his or her concentration. I chose to analyze the file 8, which talk about a summary of a crossover between The Simpsons and the Futurama. Clarifying this, I am going to explain how I do the error analysis. In the first line, I evidence that the learner wrote summary about Cinsorama instead of summary about Cinsorama. This confusion is due to the fact that the both words are pronounced in the same way, and the only difference in the spelling is that one has an A and the other has an E. It is a mistake since the student has knowledge to differentiate it. Its classification is orthographic, and the source of error is confusion of homophone words. Remediation, systematization. I suggest the student to practice dictation of homophone words to avoid possible problems. In the second line, I found three errors. The first one was the lack of a comma to separate these sentences. Therefore, the correction was to add it. This is a mistake because the student uses comma in his or her test. The classification is orthographic because it was due to a lack of punctuation, and the source of error is a lapse because it was probably an interruption in his or her concentration. The second error was spoke. This was interference with his or her mother tongue to say se habló, and a lack of the knowledge of the structure of the passive voice. Therefore, the correction was it was spoken. This is an error because it shows an ignorance of the rule. Its classification is syntax because it affects the grammatical structure, and the source is simplification because the learner tried to simplify a complex wording in an easy way. For remediation, conceptualization, I suggest the student to review the grammatical structure through tests where he or she observes its correct application. Systematization, perform an exercise where he or she determines whether it is passive voice or not. As appropriation, write a test using only a passive voice. The third error was the use of instead of from, being this is an interference with the mother tongue since of used in Spanish to express origin. It is a mistake since the high level of writing shows that he or she has the knowledge to comprehend this. The classification is syntax because it affects the structure of the sentence, and its source of error is mother tongue interference. Remediation, appropriation, make an oral presentation using sentences that show the difference between from and of. In the third line, I found two errors. The first one was about in front de. The correction is in front of. It is an error because other errors were evident in the writing when using prepositions or verbs of place in English. The classification is syntax because there is a misunderstanding at the time of writing the complex preposition, so it affected the structure of the sentence. Therefore, the source is complete rule application. Remediation, conceptualization. The student has to study the preposition of places in English through writings or conversations about addresses or locations. Systematization. The student has to do exercises where he or she has to select the correct preposition according to the context. And appropriation. The student has to write a test where he or she explains to a person how to get to a place. The second error was the omission of a comma. For this, the correction was to add it. This is an error because the same error persists in the fourth line, which means that the student doesn't know that we want to join two clauses with but we have to write a comma before. For this, the classification is orthographic and the source is incomplete rule application because he uses a comma but he doesn't know this rule. Remediation, conceptualization, write tests with the uses of a comma in opposition or contrast connectors. Systematization, complete sentences with the comma must be added before the but. Appropriation, the student has to write a test where he or she uses a construct or opposite connectors, but, however, despite. The following error is, he had a purpose, but he didn't remember what his purpose was. The correction is, he had a purpose, but he didn't remember what it was. We can consider that is an error, and that is a pragmatic error. Why? Because pragmatic studies the organization of the sentences according to the context. And here we can see a redundancy. Therefore, the source is exploiting redundancy. Remediation, conceptualization. With the help of test, underline the sentences that avoid redundancy with the subject it. Systematization, rewrite exercises where the subject is not redundant. And appropriation, make an oral presentation where you avoid to use redundancy in your sentences. In the fifth line, we find two errors. The first is later Homer brought Bender with the professor. The correction is later Homer took Bender with the professor. In this case, it is a mistake and it is lexical. Why? Because there is a confusion with the words due to the similarity of the meaning. For this, the source is confusion of sense relation. Next one is where the professor for helping to remember. The correction is where the professor to help him to remember. In this case, it is an error because the learner repeated in the seventh line. The future characters travel through time for doing it. The correction is the future characters travel through time to do it. For this, its classification is its syntax, and the source is modern tone interference because the student is borrowing from a grammatical structure of his or her mother tongue. In the seventh line, Homer had procreated creatures that were destroyed in New York City that had his DNA. The correction is Homer had procreated creatures that were destroyed in New York City. This is an error and the classification is lexical, as there is a confusion with the meaning of the verb procreate, which causes the student to add unnecessary information. Therefore, its source is exploiting redundancy. In the A line, the creation of Homer was developing. The correction is the creations of Homer were developing. It is a mistake because in the next sentence, the learner corrected this. The classification is morphosyntax because it affects a morpheme of the verb, and the source is a lab. The next one is a similar appearance to Bart. The correction is an appearance similar to Bart's. It is a mistake. The classification is syntax and the source is overgeneralization because the student keeps in mind that before a noun always goes the adjective. In 9th and 10th lines, an error is repeated. Move and start. The correction is moved and started. There are mistakes because the student shows that he understands the past tense. There are morphosyntax because it affects the time verb, the morpheme of the time verb, and their classification is a lab. In 10th line, the professor had an idea to meet in a capsule. The correction is the professor had an idea of gathering them in a capsule. It is a mistake. The classification is lexical because there is a confusion of the use of both verbs. The source is a confusion of sense relation. In conclusion, as a remediation the learner should have study and expand his or her vocabulary because he or she made several mistakes and errors due to that. Practice connectors to avoid incomprehension of ideas. Pay attention to singular and plural nouns and their tenses. Study the punctuation rules. And finally, as a recommendation, I suggest the student give the test a last reading before submitting to the teacher. To finish, mistakes and errors are inevitable in the process of learning a language, so it is normal to make it. Being that a way of learning a foreign language, don't forget it. Goodbye and thank you for your attention.